One of the claims that I make on this channel is that Earth has gone through some incredibly planet-wide Earth-destroying cataclysms only in the past few thousand years. And at the very latest, the very first major cataclysm probably only happened anywhere between maybe 6 and 10 to 15-ish thousand years ago. Now, I get it. At first glance, this claim sounds insane. And when I say Earth-altering cataclysms, by the way, I mean that in the truest sense. And I mean it in the truest sense of how our ancestors explained what happened in the past. Our ancestors are actually, you know what, it's funny, it's not me making this claim. Ultimately, it's our ancestors that are making the claim that Earth has gone through some absolutely destructive cataclysms only in the past few thousand years. This is their claim. It's not my claim. It's not anybody else's claim today. This claim did not get pulled out of thin air. A bunch of people, we were not like smoking crack one day and doing blow and sitting there and going, oh, you know what, dude? You know what? I think Earth suffered some incredible cataclysms like 1,000 years ago. And then everybody else was like, yeah, screw it. 1,000 years ago? Ah, I love it. That's what I wanted to hear. Like, that is not where we get this concept. When we go back and we start to look and read and listen to what our ancient ancestors recorded about their histories on this planet, what we find, well, we find all kinds of stuff, right? But one of the main common themes that we find across this entire planet, there is no exceptions, by the way, as long as a history goes back to a certain period of time or certain periods of time, what we find is our ancestors talking about planet-wide catastrophes absolutely annihilating life on this earth multiple times. Now, obviously, it doesn't annihilate Earth to the point to where there's no life on the planet. Obviously, we're all still here. But they don't make that claim either. Well, or at least, at the very least, it's funny, when you go back and you read a lot of these stories, you'll actually find that the survivors, when they start to tell this tale, they honestly believed that they were the last people alive. Now that says something, right? I mean, are you going to just say, oh, we're the last couple of people alive when there's still millions of people running around after a regular earthquake or something? Nobody is creating a story like that after localized catastrophes. And I say this because a lot of mainstream people, or not a lot, pretty much all of the mainstream people, they try to write off all of these catastrophes that our ancestors recorded as these little basic local events. I mean, yeah, it sucked to be there, but you know, they were just basic little local earthquakes, or maybe they found and had to deal with a small tsunami or something like that. But because they were so primitive and stupid, they didn't understand that the world wasn't ending. They thought that the world was over because there was an earthquake where they lived and it knocked down some buildings and stuff. Like this is the outlook of mainstream. They give no credit to our ancestors. Our ancestors' stories, they don't read like that. They don't talk like that. They are very clear when they say, hey, look, we had islands sinking beneath the ocean. We had islands being risen out of the ocean. We had entire swaths of land decimated by huge rolling mountains of water. We had conflagrations that absolutely swept over most of the planet, so far as our ancestors were concerned. The conflagrations, I don't know. You know what I mean? Fire basically rolled over this planet. Our ancestors record this, and this is what I want to focus on. Did I lose my train of thought there? Well, I'm out of con. Okay, my point is that when we read our ancestors' stories, there's all kinds of crazy stuff in there. But I want to focus on a very specific situation that our ancestors talk about in the past, and that is planet-wide conflagrations, planet-wide firestorms. Now, initially, this sounds insane. What do you mean planet-wide firestorm? When mainstream historians, when they go and they read these ancient histories and they see our ancestors talking about huge continent-sized fires raging and just leveling civilizations, what happens is that the mainstream takes that story and they don't take it seriously, do they? They don't listen to it. They don't care. because mainstream historians honestly believe that our ancestors were just monkeys. I mean, just a few thousand years ago. This is what the mainstream considers our ancestors. They give them zero credit, okay? And I know I've said that probably 12 times. But I can't hammer it home enough because it is something that is absolutely, A, completely offensive. I mean, absolutely offensive to everybody that lived in the past. And B, it's wrong. It is scientifically wrong to make that claim. This is funny because their mainstream buddies over in the anthropology department have no problem making the claim that humans were just like you and me right now up to about 10,000 years ago, or at least up until 10,000 years ago. Very interesting that they came to that conclusion, by the way, but that's not really for this particular talk. But even the mainstream says, hey, look, people up to 10,000-ish years ago or so had the same intellectual capabilities as we do now. So if they had these same capabilities, is it really fair to pin our ancestors as just stupid monkeys running around? And the answer is, of course, no, right? I mean, just think about the kinds of relics that have been left behind by these people. You know, things like all the temples that we find all over the planet, megalithic or otherwise. Right, it takes all of like 2 seconds to look around or hear or read what all of our ancestors were thinking and doing. Like, these people were not thinking like ooga booga level. These people were smart people. They were figuring stuff out. They were civilization builders. We know that these people were smart. So that's why it's weird when we find these insane stories that talk about all of these crazy cataclysms. And one of the crazy cataclysms, one of the crazier cataclysm types that we find embedded in everybody's ancient stories. Remember, all ancient cultures mostly have a story like this, multiple conflagration stories. This is just a fact. It's there. There's nothing you can do about it. Mainstream has, of course, gone out of their way to ignore this fact. So it's unfortunate that mainstream has decided to push aside all of these amazing stories that our ancestors talk about and instead relegate them to basically our ancestors were too stupid to realize that a forest fire was not the end of the world. All right. So we're here to make the claim that that's ridiculous. When our ancestors say that a huge planet-wide conflagration rained down on this planet, then we're going to take that at face value. And it's that simple. When our ancestors say that fire rained from the sky, we're going to take that seriously. So, for example, Heraclitus taught that the world is destroyed in conflagration every period of 10,800 years. Now, unfortunately, certain alternative research communities have latched on to this specific number. And in fact, I think a lot of Nemesis people latch onto this number as well. And that's kind of a different show. But my point of even mentioning Heraclitus is that these people are talking about these conflagrations destroying the entire planet, back during, the 540s, the 475-ishes, BC. This is what they were teaching. Aristarchus of Samos, he also taught that in a period of 2,484 years, the earth undergoes two general destructions, a combustion and then a deluge. So once again, we have this conflagration story. Conflagration? Why keep saying conflagration? It's not even a word. Conflagration. Now, the Maya also have this kind of history as well. And the Maya even talk about oil raining down from the sky and igniting in the sky and essentially raining down everywhere and just absolutely charring everything, just slaughtering it all on fire, right? I mean, you even have stories from South America talking about how entire villages drowned in oil. Now, that's different talk as well. But the point is that what we find, North Americans also have the exact same thing, fire raining down from the sky. Africans have the exact same ancient African histories. It's there as well. The main point is it takes like 2 seconds to go and start digging around in ancient cultures to find the stories of Earth-wide firestorms. So, if we have, what do we do with this? If we have all of these ancient cultures telling us that the Earth was literally burned clean by fire that came from the sky and sometimes the ground, but mostly from the sky, right? It rains fire. If we have everybody talking about this, we should just ignore it, right? Like, why bother paying attention to what everybody in the past is talking about, right? We're not going to ignore it. That's what mainstream people do. We are not going to take that approach. We're going to take our ancestors seriously. Now, all right, fine, but what do we do with this? How do we prove that this kind of stuff happened? One of the fantastic proofs that huge conflagrations roared over this planet is the fact that we find ungodly huge, thick coal beds all over planet Earth. Now, this is where things are going to get interesting. We are going to use science to prove a point, because why wouldn't we? I mean, the good news about a firestorm, for example, or fire raining down from the sky, is that there is nothing unscientific about that claim. You don't need a god or a wizard or whatever magic person that people believe our ancient ancestors believed in. You don't need any of that crazy stuff to believe that fire rained down from the sky. It's not even interesting. Scientifically, it's a legitimate statement. So, the real question, or one of the real questions, is why does mainstream ignore this? It's a scientifically valid question. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, one of the key pieces of evidence that we have that proves that planet-wide conflagrations spread across Earth is coal beds. Now, you're probably thinking, what do you mean coal beds, dude? Coal takes hundreds of millions of years to create. You're talking about conflagrations only a few thousand years ago. What, creating coal beds in the span of a few thousand years? What is this schizo garbage? What are you talking about? All right, let's get down to it. I know, we're getting to the point quicker on this channel than I usually do. I love it. I'm getting better. All right, so here, let's lay out what the mainstream believes is the main factor in creating coal. And we're only going to focus on coal in this video. There's a lot of other evidence for conflagrations, taking Earth out. But for this particular video, let's just focus on coal and the evidence that exists that helps to prove that what our ancestors say happened actually happened. All right, so let's get down to it. So for the formation, let's just use that bastion of truth, Wikipedia, and let's just kind of use them as a mainstream barometer. They're pretty good to point out all the problems with mainstream, since for whatever reason people actually trust this thing. Anyway, this is what Wikipedia says about the formation of coal. The conversion of dead vegetation into coal is called coalification. Very nice. At various times in the geologic past, Earth had dense forests in low-lying wetland areas. That's true. Dense forests, absolutely. In wetlands, sure, why not? Nothing weird about it so far. In these wetlands, the process of coalification began when dead plant matter was protected from biodegeneration and oxidation, usually by mud or acidic water, and was converted into peat. So that sentence, by the way, makes no sense. So what they're basically saying is that somehow a forest is magically covered by a huge layer of mud. Okay, fine. Already the mainstream is actually dabbling in catastrophism, because mainstream is essentially claiming that some sort of magical acidic mud or magical acidic water immediately buries the forest overnight, so that no biological degradation processes can happen. Right, so we're already into the world of stupidity. This is the mainstream. This is what the mainstream believes. A geologist will actually tell you this to your face, that this is how coal is made, and they'll do it with a straight face. And they'll believe it. They won't even question it. They don't even stop and are like, oh, wait a second. What? Okay, so here, let's keep going because it gets more stupider. All right, so, okay. Oh, yeah, okay. So it gets covered by mud or acidic water, and then it's magically converted into peat. So basically they're saying that oxidation and biodegradation is locked out from happening because of this magic mud or this magic water. But somehow, even though there's no biological stuff going on, peat magically appears. Peat is a biological situation. Peat is a living thing, right? I mean, not an individual thing, but peat is an organic matter. It's alive. It grows. So basically, they're saying that biological processes are happening when zero biological processes are also happening. Right here, like right here in Wikipedia, we're already finding the dumbest crap. All right, okay, let's move on. This trapped the carbon in immense peat bogs that were eventually deeply buried by sediments. Okay, where did these sediments come from? That's a good question. Where the hell do all these sediments come from? You know what I love about geologists? Geologists just, for whatever reason, they believe that magical layering just happens over millions of years. Somehow magical, dust and dirt and mud just appears and it starts to build up. They don't know where it comes from. They don't say anything. But no, it just appears, bro. Don't worry about it. It just shows up and builds layers. Like, God. All right. What are we at? Okay. Then, over millions of years, because of course, everything has to take a million years because there's no other possible way that things can be done, right? So, over a million years, the heat and pressure of deep burial caused the loss of water, methane, and carbon dioxide, and increased the portion of carbon. Okay. Okay. Can we prove this? Can you guys show me some experiments that prove this? And there's none, so don't bother looking. There's zero. The grade of coal produced depended on the maximum pressure and temperature reached. With lignite, also called brown coal, produced under relatively mild conditions, and sub-bituminous coal, or anthracite coal, also called hard coal or black coal, produced in turn with increasing temperature and pressure. So, this is where they believe coal is formed. Somehow you get magical acidic mud or dirt or water layers or whatever that are supposed to stop biological degradation, which means that all biology would have to stop. I mean, if you're going to stop all the microbes from operating, that means nothing else is operating. But in the same sentence, they literally say then peat magically appears. But there shouldn't be any biological events taking place. Okay. And then you have magical layers of dirt show up, and somehow it magically starts to build up, and then the pressure from that dirt creates heat, which then heats up and pressurizes the peat, and then the peat magically turns into coal. But don't worry, it takes millions of years. We can't prove it right now, bro, because it takes, 10 million years to happen. So I can't actually show you how this process is done. You just have to trust me. That is literally the mainstream's scientific point of view. That's what they believe is a scientifically valid position. Right? The whole situation is dumb. It's stupid. All right, they, even in their own description of how coal is made, it doesn't make sense. It literally does not add up. Okay, so anyway, we can immediately look at what the mainstream believes is the creation of coal, and we can throw it away. Like, we can just get rid of it. There's no reason to have it. There's no experimentation that proves it. The theory in and of itself is dumb. I mean, it's outright stupid. Okay, all right. It's just okay. So we're going to get rid of the mainstream version of how coal is created. And it's important to do this, by the way, because they believe that everything takes 10 billion years to happen. Right? That's their excuse for getting out of having to explain all of these dumb theories that they teach as fact. Like, there's no reason for it. Okay, all right. So, that begs the question then. If we're going to throw away the mainstream's concept of what creates coal, what are we left with? Is there an alternative way to create coal? And ironically enough, it takes about 3 seconds to go find alternative explanations, scientific explanations, for how coal is actually created. Yeah, we'll get to the artifacts in just a little bit, but it is extremely important to understand how coal can be formed almost immediately, because once we have this scientific proof in our back pocket, that makes looking at all of these out-of-place artifacts that are found in coal mines, those discoveries will no longer seem extraordinarily mysterious, and instead will begin to make sense in the context of real history, of the history that the science is proving now every day, and of course it will substantiate the claims made by our ancestors. Alright, so let's go into the other various ways that coal can be created. Quickly, Now, you may be wondering why we need a quick coal process, and the reason why is this. We are currently operating within the realm of science. The realm of science is proving to us that Earth has had major catastrophes only in the past few thousand years. If these catastrophes have happened only in the past few thousand years, that means we do not have millions of years for coal to be created. Even more interesting is that when we find artifacts in coal, those artifacts, by all intents and purposes, they don't seem like they've been sitting there for 100 million years either. So just basic observational evidence shows us that if we are going to find anomalous objects hidden inside coal, those objects can't sit there for millions of years untouched, because natural processes are going to absolutely, degrade them. If you find a piece of metal in coal, casted metal of some sort, if it's there for a million years, it's going to degrade. There's no way to get around it, really, because the process of coal takes 100 million years. Then that means you've probably got at least a good maybe 10 millions of years for a particular artifact to start to degrade before the coal truly encapsulates it to preserve it. And I don't even really have any proof that even if you had an object stuck in a lump of coal, let's just say a metal object, let's say a brass object. We throw a brass object in the middle of a lump of coal and then let it sit for 100 million years. We don't have any proof that the coal would legitimately preserve that artifact. This is actually an important point to remember, is that we do not have scientific evidence to support people's claims, or I should say at least alternative researchers' claims, that these objects are legitimately, say, 100 million years old. So, okay, let's cover this really fast before we go further. So we've got the mainstream perspective. Their perspective is trash. We can discard it. Fine. The alternative research community also has a perspective. And obviously, it's not everybody, but there is a particular camp of thought that believes that, hey, look, these artifacts that are found in coal, they're dated to 100 million years ago. Now, who dates that? Now, who gives that date? Well, it's the mainstream. Mainstream has precisely zero, and I mean zero, capability of accurately dating pretty much anything. And that's just the truth. The reality is radiocarbon type dating or radiometric dating in general is trash. We have no way of knowing something is 100 million years old. Let's just put that bluntly. And I'm not going to go into that any further. That's a different show as well. But that's the scientific reality. Our dating methods are trash, and that's just what it is. But there is a section in the alternative research community that really does believe that the mainstream data is correct and the mainstream dating capabilities are generally right. The reason why they actually take this position is the exact same reason why mainstream researchers will take the position as well. Because once you have a theory locked in, so for example, there's a group out there on the alt side that says, hey, look, humans were around 200 million years ago. Like, that's a claim, and you can go find pretty huge books on that subject. And one of the reasons why this particular school of thought exists is because we find these weird artifacts embedded in coal. And then, of course, the mainstream has dated this coal artifact, for example, to 100 million years ago, right? Because you need millions of years to build up coal according to the mainstream. So that immediately dates, in your general person's eye, and in the alternative side as well, this particular school of thought, they immediately say, oh, look at that. Mainstream, they're using their great science. They've dated this to 100 million years ago. My theory is now saying that humans lived 100 million years ago, and look at the evidence I am providing. Okay, this is a problem, and I would like to caution against mainstream researchers from following this route. Because as I said, we know for a fact that we have no good dating method. So why do the alternative people who believe in this kind of a theory or whatever, why do they latch onto this? They know the mainstream is lying. They know that they're wrong, but they latch onto this date. The reason why these people will latch onto this date is because it factors into their pet theory. They are perpetrating the exact same intellectual crime that a mainstream researcher does. When a mainstream researcher nowadays approaches a subject regarding ancient history, they are not looking to redate anything, or at the very least, they're not looking to redate anything by thousands of years. Maybe they'll redate something, maybe a decade from what the mainstream chronology tells them. Maybe, but they're not looking to shake that tree. They are not looking to start a paradigm. Because if they start a paradigm, they risk losing their job and they're and then they're kicked out of their institution, and then they go insane, and then they become hobos, and then they start begging me for money, and I don't have any money, so that means I have to slap a hobo. And then they get away from me, and then they call me a conspiracy theorist, and they laugh at me because I don't believe in the mainstream chronology. So that, they try to avoid that. But the point is that a mainstream researcher, when let's say they send something out to get, a sample of something to the labs to get a date, right? Generally speaking, the dates will come back kind of all over the place. You can find, for example, an artifact could be sent out, and one lab will say this is, 10,000 BC. Another lab will say it's like, 70 million BC. And then another lab will say 2000 BC. Now, whichever date the mainstream chronology currently supports, that's the date that researcher will keep. So, for example, in this case, they'll keep the 2000 BC date, and they'll get rid of the 7000 and the 7 million and the 10,000 BC dates. They'll get rid of those because it does not line up with their pet theory. The alternative research community is just as guilty with this. Right? They love hearing, oh yeah, this artifact is 100 million years old because it was found in coal that had to have taken 100 million years to create. And then people start writing books, and then they create their own little silo area. And then, anyway, we want to avoid that. And we don't need to go down that route anyway. All we have to do is stay objective. Once we stay objective and start looking for the serious answers, and we call out the garbage on all sides, suddenly a clearer picture begins to appear. And this picture is what our ancestors were already painting for us anyway. So it's good stuff. All right. Oh, and one more thing. What's even more funny about the mainstream's idea of how coal forms? Because remember, one of the things that we have discovered when, we're mining coal and stuff like that is you find a lot of layers of coal. It's not just like one layer. You find really thick layers of coal, one on top of another. The only way that you can get that kind of coalification, I guess you could say, or stratification of coal at that level, is you need to have events that so you have a forest that grows, is miraculously covered by mud and water, acidic water or whatever, and then somehow becomes peat. Then another forest grows on top of that. Then the exact same event happens again, which creates the next layer, and then another, layer exactly the same way. This can happen up to like 7 layers. I think there's probably places where it's even more, but at the very least, there's areas where you have 7 different layers of coal, right? And they're thick too. It's not like 1 foot layers of coal. You have like, dozens of feet, if not hundreds of feet layers of coal. And these things just randomly spawned on top of each other over hundreds of millions of years. The funny part about that particular scientific find, that's a geological fact. There are layers of coal just like that. They're everywhere. The fact that exists, what that says is that you literally need billions of years to have those coal seams build up. What's even funnier is that life has not been around on this planet long enough to actually coincide with the layers of coal that we find. How do you like that? The mainstream's theory doesn't even jive with the mainstream's theory. It's hilarious. Okay, so we're going to move on. All right. Oh, also, when we look at these seams of coal, it is common for miners to find what would be called essentially a fossilized tree in these coal beds. What's even more interesting is that these trees are still standing upright. These trees are not, they're not decayed. They're not even knocked down. These trees are still rooted into their forest position. Even more funny is that you'll even find imprints of all these leaves and stuff like that from the forest that existed before. So what that means is that these forests could not have been taken down over millions of years of sitting in like a boggy marsh. What this proves is that some event must have quickly happened to these forests to bury them almost instantaneously. Because if it doesn't happen instantaneously, the trees will rot. All the plant matter will just rot. That's just life. That's how things go. They will putrefy. If no putrefaction can happen, that means the event had to have taken place essentially instantly. So it's weird that we find, upright trees. Basically the forests in a lot of those coal areas, they're still sitting there, just buried in coal. It's fascinating stuff. What that proves is that catastrophism is real. It's funny, the mainstream accidentally proves catastrophism is real, but because they throw it back 100 million years ago, they can kind of say, oh yeah, catastrophes, yeah, of course catastrophes happened, but that was forever ago. They would never happen 2,000 years ago. It is impossible. And that is a scientifically incorrect statement. It's a lie. It's a straight up lie. Anyway, all right, so now let's get to it. How do we make coal quickly? How do we do it? But how do we create coal that resembles the layers that we observe today? So a few things have to be accounted for. One of the things we already just talked about was the fact that we are going to have to create coal beds or coal seams in such a way that plants can be impressioned, right? This is the other thing that's hilarious. Somehow we have impressions of like ferns and plants and trees and stuff in these blocks of coal. If these plants were being torn down and the coal took 100 million years to form, how can you have an impression? How? This is a legitimate question, because if we are finding impressions of ferns and other plant life embedded in coal blocks, what that tells us is that regardless of which theory we go with, what it means is that that particular plant had to have stayed in its organic form during the entirety of the process that would have created the coal around it. So if you are a mainstream geologist, you literally have no choice but to believe that a fern leaf that we have an impression of embedded in coal, and this is quite common by the way, that fern leaf sat there for 100 million years and had zero degradation so that that imprint could form. And then once that imprint formed, it evaporated. This is what mainstream believes. For the other side, we still have to explain it, right? Because now we have to explain, all right, fine, we do have this impression. How do we get an impression in coal quickly? What are the conditions needed to get to that point geologically? And it's quite simple. Let me give you a quick example that's kind of, well, here, let's give one quick example. Everybody knows Mount St. Helens. One of the interesting things that was found during the Mount St. Helens, or I should say one of the things that was found after, the eruption of Mount St. Helens, the fallout, they found that a lot of trees on one side had been essentially turned into coal. Right there, pow, immediately, overnight, instantly, 1 second, flash cold. Half of the tree was literally a hard coal, and the other tree was still bark. What that shows right there, immediately, physical observational proof, this is documented, that you can create coal out of a tree instantaneously. The reason why I start with a Mount St. Helens example is because A, it's recent, but B, that's a catastrophic event. Now, it's a very minor catastrophic event in the sense and scale of what we are talking about with catastrophes. But even though Mount St. Helens was a relatively small catastrophic event, what we found right there is we found that there is indeed a process related to catastrophism that can instantaneously form coal. Right there. I don't know what else to tell mainstream people. It's right there, and they know it too. And they ignore it. It's just ignored. And it gets even worse when you start looking into the Mount St. Helens thing, because even if you're a mainstream geologist, and I think some do this, you can start to actually kind of make arguments about how stratification may be able to happen once the organic part of the tree finally degrades, and maybe a layer is anyway, it doesn't matter. The main point right here is that we already know that you can create coal instantly just from that catastrophe alone. Even more interesting is if you want to go out and you want to make charcoal, like for a barbecue, you can make charcoal right now in your backyard if you wanted to. There is an entire process of just creating charcoal. Obviously, that process is quick because you can go down to a store and buy infinite bags of charcoal, right? These pieces of charcoal you are buying down there, it's coal. Charcoal is a form of coal. This coal was made in a factory. It didn't take 10 million years. These guys are not mining charcoal, right? This charcoal is created from biological matter. And there's a particular burning process that takes place to create the charcoal that we use. How do you like that? All you have to do is go down to Walmart and you can prove that coal does not take 100 million years to create. All right, fine. We have established that we have some precedents for coal being created either, relatively quickly through the burning process that can be done. And there's videos on all of that. I'm not going to get into it. Just go Google it or not. Don't go use a different engine. I don't know. Anyway, go look it up. It's all over the place. It's not complicated. It's actually fun. I've done it. It's a nice little experiment. Anyway, so we have precedents for coal being created either instantaneously with the Mount St. Helens event or within a few hours utilizing, an industrialist situation right now. Anyway, so we know for a fact that we can create a form of coal without having to inject 100 million years to explain the formation. Now, let's move on to our next problem. Like I said, we find impressions of biological material in the coal. So if we are heating stuff up, like if we're lighting things on fire, because that's how the coal would be created, right? Obviously, Mount St. Helens burned the crap out of everything. That was one hell of an explosion. We need heat. Now, this is where we find our first synergy with the mainstream situation. Both theories require heat. All right, fine. And of course, the difference here is that the mainstream's heat source comes from pressure, but where does the instant heat come from? Well, we've already proved it. We've already talked about where it comes from. It comes from a catastrophic source. So what we can start with is we can say, all right, fine, a catastrophic source, but what source? What are you talking about? Let's go and look back at what our ancestors talk about. One of the main factors that we find all over the planet with respect to ancient mythology, or realistically ancient history in this case, is that we find everybody talking about a time where fire rained down from the sky. Now there, we're done. There you go. We know where our fire came from. We know where our heat came from. It's literally that simple. Our ancestors say, hey, look, the gods in the sky were fighting, and one of the fallouts of these fights is that a ton of bitumen and oil begins to rain down on the planet. I know it sounds crazy at first, but we're not going to go into detail on it. We're just going to follow what they say, and we're going to take it at face value so that I can get to the main point of this video 10 hours later. But our ancestors talk about a gooey liquid falling from the sky that once it hit the atmosphere of Earth, it ignited. Now, what does oil need to burn, for example? To burn oil, you need oxygen. So once you have oil entering Earth's atmosphere from above, pow, you've got the friction to create the fire, to ignite it, and then you've got the oxygen to sustain it. So as all of this oil starts to rain down, oil and bitumen, it's both. What happens is that all of this on fire oil will begin to land in the forests and the general landscape in a lot of areas on the planet. This, of course, would create one hell of a conflagration, wouldn't it? I mean, can you imagine that? Just billions upon billions upon billions of gallons of oil, or drums of oil, just raining down from the sky, igniting as it hits the atmosphere, and then it just starts drenching wherever the hell it lands. I mean, it's just like napalm at this point. As all of this fire starts to cover huge forests, what happens is that it ignites these trees, and it ignites them with extreme heat. Basically, it begins to flash charcoalize them. All right, so we know where our heat comes from now, and we know what starts to burn the trees. But here's the problem. All right, you say, fine, that's schizo, but all right, fine, whatever. Our ancestors say it, and there is evidence for all this, by the way. All this is scientifically backed. For those of you who are still new to this or are unsure, this is all based on real scientific evidence. For example, did you know that Halley's Comet is covered or has tons of hydrocarbons on it? Yeah, basically oil. They are, not even NASA admits that comets have hydrocarbons on them, right? We have I think it's Titan that is supposed to technically be covered in hydrocarbons. Oil, that's what oil is. Oil and bitumen are hydrocarbons. There's no reason to disbelieve this stuff couldn't have come from space. Even NASA's own data shows that. Okay, anyway. So if you're wondering how that's possible, the reality is we know for a fact that planetary and cometary bodies contain hydrocarbon material. So if you have a planetary body or a cometary body flyby that's rich in a hydrocarbon material, and it gets ripped off of the planet and then Earth gets hit by it, there you have your oil. You have your hydrocarbon that becomes flammable. All right, so we have basically some sort of a hydrocarbon raining down from space. It ignites, hits the forests. Your next question is of course, all right, fine, you're crazy, but fine, oil's raining, whatever. But wouldn't the trees just burn up? I mean, everything would, in theory, just burn up really quick, right? I mean, that's got to be one hell of a fire. And you're right, those fires would have been extremely hot because you need extreme heat to get the coal to form. You can't just sit there baking it at 70 degrees and hope that it makes coal. That's not going to happen. Right, we showed with the Mount St. Helens event that you need one hell of a heat wave or a heat blast to rip through trees or to at least singe and char trees to get that coal to form instantly. So we've got the heat, but you're right. I mean, if we've got that kind of heat burning in a forest, the forest is going to be annihilated. I mean, the forest is going to turn to ash. Yeah, you're right. That is what should have happened. Here is the kicker. What we need is a way to instantly snuff out that fire. We've got to get rid of that fire after the fire has begun to create all of that charcoal in a heavily thick, jungle or wood. Pick your poison. It happened all over the place. But we've got to put that fire out, because if the fire is allowed to burn, you're right, it's going to burn all the trees and we're not going to get anything but ash. We don't have that. Or we have layers of ash, but you know what I mean. We're trying to prove coal. So we have to extinguish that fire really quick. And then we've got to cover it with sediment as well. How do we do that? Well, our ancestors' stories talk about that as well. What they say is that there were either huge mountains of water being dragged over the planet by the gods, or huge tsunamis that were basically accomplishing the same thing, roaring into the land right after the fires were ignited. So basically, picture this. You have rains of fire just coming down and smashing into these huge lush forests, instantly igniting everything in its path. As it starts to ignite everything, you then, just minutes right behind it, you have a huge mountain of water just rushing in and rolling over the entire landscape, immediately putting out the fires and putting a layer of silt over the entire situation. So what you find here is you find a way to create the charcoal on the trees quickly, almost instantaneously, and then you have a way to then extinguish that fire so that that bed of coal can then be created. Now, so what happens is that all of that stuff gets extinguished. Okay, great. Now you have this huge, lush environment that has now been blackened and turned into coal, and then you have a ton of silt that just rushes in over it from the various tsunamis that come in right after, and then it just puts layers and layers of silt, rock, and dirt on top of it, ensuring that that seam of coal then becomes a seam of coal. This is how you get to preserve a certain amount of plant matter that could then leave impressions within the coal itself. Now, we don't find these impressions, the impressions, relatively speaking, are rare. They're not everywhere, but they're there. They're found, right? We have trees standing up. The only way you can do all of that is if the fire is extinguished really, really, really quick. And it's just luck of a draw that somewhat, statistically speaking, I guess I should say, statistically speaking, some of it would be still organically there, and it would be smashed in as those waters rush in and extinguish everything. And then what happens is that you get the impression of that fern leaf, for example, embedded into the new coal that has been snuffed out, or at least that fire that was burning the coal has been snuffed out, so it does not burn the fern leaf. Isn't that amazing? That's all it takes to make coal. This is a scientifically viable situation, and it's one that our ancestors 100% described. So when we start finding seams of coal, ironically enough, actually seams of coal literally prove catastrophism is real, even in the mainstream, because you have to have catastrophism to create those seams of coal. There's no way around it. To create what the mainstream says, you've got to have that land buried by some pretty crazy events. You can't get away from it. There's nothing you can do. You have to. Stratification only takes literally minutes. We know this for a scientific fact. So of course, catastrophes have to be real, and mainstream will kind of say that, but they always push that stuff hundreds of million years back in the past. Once they do that, they don't have to deal with it anymore. And they certainly aren't going to admit that a catastrophe like this could have happened during the memory of mankind. Like, they will never admit that. But we have all evidence to the contrary. So when we start to find all of these weird artifacts buried in coal seams, like we find gold chains, bells, pots, all these weird metal artifacts that would have survived a fire, right? These are artifacts that would have survived that kind of heat. Being embedded in coal, we can now say, hey, look, these artifacts that we're finding are not 100 million years old. They're not 250 million years old. Humans were not walking around 250 million years making gold chains. We now know that for a fact. We don't have to say that because we can say, hey, look, these artifacts that we are finding that really do match the skill level of certain civilizations only a few thousand years ago are not 100 million years old. We don't need to say that. All we have to do is say, hey, look, our ancestors say this area was inundated with a fire from the sky. And of course, if there's a village in the middle of that forest or that jungle that's being conflagrated, what we would expect to find is exactly what we do find if there was indeed a habitation there. We should expect to find, for example, metal artifacts that would survive that inundation. And sure enough, that's the kind of stuff that we find embedded in coal. I mean, we found all kinds of stuff embedded in coal, and I was gonna do that in this video, but now it's gonna be for a different video. But at least now we have a general scientific explanation as to how these coal seams are formed and why we find anachronistic objects within these coal seams. This is a legitimate science. This is how we prove catastrophism. This is how we prove that our ancestors are not psychotic, right? This is the proof. All right, so with this proof in hand, when we start to analyze all of those anachronistic objects that have been discovered within coal seams, we can now look at that situation in a much different light. Even better, we can look at it in a real scientific light, and then what we'll do is we can compare and contrast all of our ancestors' stories relative to what we find within the coal, and then maybe we can start to make some sense out of all of the crazy stuff that we read and hear from our ancient ancestors' histories. All right, with all of this in mind, in the next video, we will cover the actual artifacts that were discovered in coal, and we can look at them through an entirely different light, and that might actually help us prove other aspects of what truly happened in the past. Or I'll get sidetracked and completely forget to make the video, but whatever. The main point here is that we can now discard the mainstream theory on how coal is made, so that when we look at these artifacts, we don't have to say, hey, look, they're 200 million years old. That also means that we can eliminate alternative researchers who are saying that, these objects that are found in coal prove that humans were around 200 million years ago. And what this does for us is that it gets us closer to a truth. One of the things that we have to do when we employ critical thinking and the scientific method is that we need to eliminate all the different possibilities, especially if they're theoretical. The more of these theoretical possibilities that we end up eliminating, the closer we get to the truth. I mean, that's just how science is supposed to be done, and that is what we are going to do when we approach all of those anachronistic objects in the next video. All right, I'm done. I gotta go do chores or something.